But this actually transitions well into the next part I want to talk about besides red flag laws. I know we've focused on that because you've written a lot about it. I've advocated for them in the past, but I also wanted to get into the other reaction from, President Biden, which was to call for a nationwide assault weapons ban in the wake of the Buffalo shooting. Can you give us a little bit of your reaction to that?
I mean, you hear this every time. We always go back to the old assault weapons ban and the conclusion that the old assault weapons ban didn't really contribute materially to any reduction in gun violence. But that's, a lot of water is under the bridge since that time. And quite frankly, a lot of assault weapons, a lot of AR-15s have been sold. And so the thing that I would say about AR-15s, the theory behind it appears to basically be, because there doesn't seem to be any real evidence that a person is more likely to be a mass shooter when they own an AR-15, because there have been a lot of mass shootings that take place with handguns. The theory
it's actually not the most common weapon,
right?
According to the Washington Post's database.
Right. It's not the most common weapon for mass shooting. A pistol still is. The theory seems to be that, and again, and AR-15s are not very common at all in gun violence writ large. They're also not common in suicides. So, if you're talking about gun violence, the three big categories of gun violence that worry Americans: suicide, a rifle is not your weapon of choice typically. Regular, sort of quote unquote, regular street crime. Rifle is not the weapon of choice there. It's hard to conceal. More people die to fists and hammers and bats and all of that than to rifles. And then mass shootings, an AR style weapon is not necessarily the weapon of choice in a mass shooting. So the theory seems to be we're going to ban a weapon that is the most popular rifle sold in the United States, because in a very, 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 very small percentage of the time, it might be more lethal in specific mass shootings than a handgun would be. And that doesn't,
which is questionable in and of itself too.
Very questionable. I mean, I think
any gun is more lethal in a mass shooting environment where you're killing people who are defenseless.
I think the one circumstance where you could make that case most clearly would be Las Vegas.
Sure.
Very, very, long range, but we haven't seen examples like that. And so is that a reason to ban a weapon that is a weapon of choice, not just for, shooting at a range, recreational use, but it's a weapon of choice for home defense. It is a weapon that people use and store in their home to defend their home. And I know that there are people. Yeah. I know there are people who say, no, it's not a good home defense weapon. And there's controversy in the home defense, self-defense community about it. But there are a lot of folks who are professional, there are a lot of folks who are professional home and self-defense experts who say that there's a lot to commend an AR-15 as a home defense weapon. And particularly if you're not somebody who's spent a lot of time in the range with a handgun, because a handgun is harder to fire accurately than an AR-15. It's a lot harder to fire accurately.
And I think the other big point to make about President Biden's call for, renewing the federal assault weapons ban as a reaction to Buffalo, he's explicitly said this was one of the things we could do to prevent shootings like Buffalo. But I mean, New York has an assault weapons ban. It has one that's more strict than what the federal ban was. And the shooter bought a New York legal AR-15
and modified it.
And then he illegally modified it. But the assault weapons ban had no effect essentially on what he did. And obviously, again, like I mentioned with the red flag laws, he knew he was illegally modifying it. He knew what he was doing was illegal. He did not
He
care.
did it anyway.
Obviously, all of these, they don't care about the illegality of what they're doing with their guns because they go to murder people, which there isn't a person on the planet who isn't aware that murdering people is highly illegal. So, it's just...
one of the things I when I talk to people who are mystified by are mystified that a normal human being would own an AR-15. They're just, in gun rights, in states where gun rights are well protected and there's a gun culture, you don't have to explain yourself. Of course, you'd have an AR-15. It's and where I live, I would be surprised if I met somebody and they don't have one.
Right.
But a lot of people live in parts of the country and are part of cultures in America. They can't fathom it. They can't. It just doesn't compute. And one of the ways that I describe it is that, we have an inherent right of self-defense. This is something that's fundamentally embedded within the Second Amendment. It would be an unenumerated right under the Ninth Amendment, even if it wasn't in the Second Amendment. This would be, a right rooted in American history. And so we have a right of self-defense. Well, a right of self-defense is meaningless if it's not a right of effective self-defense. So if somebody has a pistol and you're not allowed to own a handgun, it doesn't do me much good to say, well, but you can punch him, David. That's not, thanks for not prosecuting me for punching him,
Right.
And so it has to be effective self-defense. Well, what does effective self-defense mean? It means effective against foreseeable threats. Effective against foreseeable threats. Now, a tank isn't a foreseeable threat, right? So sort of this idea that it's a complete, I'm not going to take umbrage at, say, a ban against me owning a javelin, right? Because a tank is not a foreseeable threat. That's not really dealing with my right of self-defense. But what is the most foreseeable threat to me? It is a person who would attack me with a semi-automatic firearm. That is the most, it's not a six shooter, It's generally probably not a pump action shotgun. It's probably somebody attacking with a semi-automatic firearm with a standard capacity magazine. So if that's the most reasonably foreseeable threat, then I should be able to own a semi-automatic firearm with a standard capacity magazine. And if you're saying I cannot own a semi-automatic firearm with a standard capacity magazine, what you are telling me is I, as a matter of law, should be less able to defend myself than a standard criminal is able to attack me. And that strikes me as sort of a fundamentally unjust stance.